In a daring display of conviction, woke waitress Karen boldly refused to serve Clint Eastwood at a bustling diner, and just 30 minutes later, her boss stormed in, setting off a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the establishment. The blade caught the afternoon light as it sliced through the air. Karen Davis didn't flinch, even as the steel stopped a hair's breadth from her throat. The abandoned warehouse, their practice space for months, suddenly felt claustrophobic, the dust motes suspended in shafts of light, the only movement besides her shallow breathing. "You hesitated," she said, her voice steady despite the knife at her neck. "You're still hesitating." Across from her, Clint Eastwood's hand trembled slightly, causing the knife tip to graze her skin, not enough to draw blood, but enough to remind them both what was at stake. His eyes, normally analytical and detached, were wide with an emotion Mia hadn't seen in him before: fear. "I can't do this," he whispered, lowering the knife. "Even knowing what's coming, I can't." Mia stepped back, disappointment and dread forming a tight knot in her stomach. 3 months of preparation, and he still couldn't follow through. The radiation badge clipped to her belt seemed to grow heavier, a constant reminder of the invisible threat slowly spreading throughout the facility. "We're out of time, Clint." She ran her fingers through her cropped black hair, a nervous habit from before the accident. "The containment protocols aren't holding. If we don't convince them we've found a solution..." A sound like thunder shook the building, followed by the distinctive wail of the facility's emergency sirens. Both of them froze, recognizing the pattern. 3 long blasts, a pause, then 3 more. Containment breach. Their phones buzzed simultaneously with the automated alert. "Emergency protocol Delta initiated. All personnel return to stations immediately." In the distance, they could hear shouting and the squeal of tires as the first response teams mobilized. James's face had gone pale, the knife now hanging limply at his side. "It's too late," he murmured, eyes unfocused. Mia grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. "Listen to me, we can still fix this. But you have to decide right now, are you in or out?" Around them, dust shook loose from the rafters as another tremor rocked the foundation. The choice hung between them, heavier than the knife, sharper than its edge. James looked at the blade in his hand, then back at Mia's determined face. Something shifted in his expression: resignation, resolve, or perhaps simply the acknowledgement that some boundaries once crossed could never be restored. "I'm in," he said, slipping the knife into its sheath with newfound steadiness. "But God help us both." As they rushed toward the door, toward the chaos emerging outside, Mia felt a strange sense of clarity amidst the adrenaline. The future they'd feared was finally here, crashing down around them like the walls of their carefully constructed lives, and she was surprised to discover how ready she felt to burn. 6 months earlier, Mia had been a different person in a different life. As the newly appointed safety director for Helios Advanced Research Technologies, she'd taken pride in running the tightest ship in the industry. Her office walls displayed her credentials: a PhD in nuclear engineering, certifications in hazardous materials management, and 3 consecutive annual awards for workplace safety excellence. At 34, she was the youngest director in the company's history, a fact that both energized and terrified her. "Your 3 o'clock is here," her assistant announced through the intercom. Mia straightened her blazer and checked her reflection in the computer screen. Professionalism was her armor, especially when meeting new team members. The man who walked in wasn't what she expected. Dr. James Eastwood was in his mid-40s, with prematurely gray hair and the slight stoop of someone who'd spent too many years hunched over laboratory equipment. His handshake was firm but brief, his eyes never quite meeting hers. "I've reviewed your safety protocols," he said without preamble, setting a tablet on her desk. "They're inadequate." Mia blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "Excuse me." "For Project Prometheus, your containment procedures don't account for quantum entanglement effects at the scale we're working with." She leaned back in her chair, studying him. Eastwood's reputation preceded him: brilliant but difficult, recruited from CERN after some unspecified differences of opinion with management. Helios had been eager to bring him on board for their groundbreaking energy research. "Dr. Keller, I assure you our protocols exceed industry standards by... Industry standards, he interrupted, a slight edge to his voice, are designed for conventional nuclear research. What we're doing is anything but conventional. That much was true. Project Prometheus aimed to revolutionize energy production through controlled quantum fission, theoretically producing 10 times the energy with a fraction of the radioactive waste. If successful, it would transform the global energy landscape. If unsuccessful, well, that was precisely why Helios had hired her. Perhaps you should explain your concerns in detail, Mia said, pushing aside her initial irritation. Safety wasn't about ego, it was about preventing catastrophe. For the next hour, Keller outlined scenarios so theoretical they bordered on science fiction. Yet his mathematics was sound, his reasoning meticulous. As he spoke, Mia felt a chill settling in her bones. If he was right, they were venturing into unknown territory with blindfolds on. Why hasn't anyone else flagged these issues? She asked finally. Keller's smile was thin, humorless. Because acknowledging them would mean delaying the project by years, and no one wants to tell the board that their billion-dollar investment needs to go back to the drawing board. But you're telling me someone has to be the voice of reason. His eyes finally met hers, and she saw something unexpected, not arrogance, but weariness. The fatigue of someone who'd been fighting this battle alone. That night, Mia stayed late, reviewing Keller's models until her vision blurred. By morning, she'd reached two conclusions. He was right about the risks, and bringing these concerns to upper management would likely end her career before it changed any minds. When she called Keller at 5 a.m., he answered on the first ring as if he'd been waiting. "We need to implement additional safeguards without alerting management," she said without greeting. "Can you help me?" His response was immediate. "Meet me in Lab 7 in 30 minutes. Thus began their clandestine partnership. By day, Mia maintained her role as the company's safety figurehead, signing off on the official protocols while privately documenting their flaws. By night, she and Keller installed additional monitoring systems, programmed unauthorized emergency procedures, and prepared contingency plans that grew increasingly desperate as the project approached its critical phase. What they couldn't have anticipated was Manager Johnson, the project's lead scientist, stumbling upon their unauthorized modifications 3 weeks before the first major test. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Chen demanded, confronting them in Mia's office after hours. Her normally composed demeanor had given way to barely contained fury. "You've compromised months of calibrations." "We've implemented necessary safety measures," Mia countered, standing her ground despite the knot forming in her stomach. "The original protocols were designed by people with decades more experience than either of you," Chen cut in. "You had concerns. Fine, you should have brought them to the team." "We tried," Keller said quietly. "You weren't listening." Chen's expression hardened. "I'm reporting this to the board tomorrow. In the meantime, don't touch anything else." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "And Mia, I expected better from you." After she left, silence hung heavy between them. "She'll have us both fired by morning," Mia said finally, the reality of their situation sinking in. Keller's response chilled her. "That's the least of our problems, without our modifications when they run that test." He didn't need to finish. They both knew what the models predicted: catastrophic containment failure, radiation release, casualties. "What do we do?" Mia asked, surprising herself with the question. 2 months ago, she would have followed protocol, trusted the chain of command. Now she was contemplating. What exactly? Keller looked at her, his expression unreadable. "How far are you willing to go to prevent a disaster?" It was the pivotal moment, though she wouldn't recognize it until much later. The point at which Mia Winters, dutiful safety director with an impeccable record, began her transformation into something else entirely. "Whatever it takes," she said, and meant it. The next day, Dr. Chen never made it to the board meeting. A family emergency called her away suddenly. At least, that's what her hastily sent email explained. In her absence, the project continued, incorporating Mia and Keller's modifications without scrutiny. Only the two of them knew that Chen was actually sedated in a private medical facility, recovering from what would be diagnosed as acute stress-induced psychosis after she was found behaving erratically in the facility parking lot, a condition triggered by a compound Keller had synthesized and Mia had slipped into her coffee. "She'll be fine in a few days," Keller assured Mia as they monitored the facility's systems that evening. "By then, we'll have implemented everything and erased our tracks." Mia nodded mechanically, trying to ignore, the voice in her head screaming that she'd crossed a line from which there was no return. "We did what was necessary," she said, as much to convince herself as him. But the moral compromises were just beginning. As Project Prometheus accelerated toward its critical test phase, more obstacles arose. A skeptical board member suffered a convenient data breach that exposed his extramarital affairs. Key security personnel were reassigned after anonymous tips about regulatory violations. Each move orchestrated with clinical precision by Keller, each one tacitly approved by Mia. They justified every action as necessary for the greater good, preventing a potential catastrophe that could affect thousands. But with each ethical boundary they crossed, Mia felt pieces of her old self falling away, replaced by someone harder, more calculating. Then came the accident. It happened during a routine power calibration, a surge that should have been impossible given their safeguards. 3 researchers were exposed to radiation before the automatic systems engaged. 2 recovered. The third, a young physicist named Michael Torres, wasn't so lucky. As Mia stood outside his hospital room 3 days later, watching him struggle through the early stages of acute radiation syndrome, the weight of their decisions finally hit her full force. "We could have prevented this," she whispered to Keller, who stood silently beside her. "We tried." His voice was hollow. "But we didn't go far enough." That night, as they sat in Keller's sparsely furnished apartment reviewing data from the accident, Mia confronted the truth they'd both been avoiding. "The project is fundamentally flawed, isn't it? No amount of safety protocols will make it safe." Keller nodded slowly. "The quantum instability is inherent to the process. Prometheus should never have moved beyond theoretical research. Then we need to shut it down completely." "Management won't do that," he said, eyes fixed on the scrolling data. "They've invested too much. The only way to stop this is—" He trailed off, but Mia understood. They had discussed contingencies for worst-case scenarios, including a controlled system failure that would damage the facility enough to halt the project without causing catastrophic harm. "Sabotage," she said, the word strange on her tongue. Keller finally looked at her, his expression grave. "Can you live with that? Because once we start down this path—" "I already can't live with myself," Mia replied, thinking of Torres fighting for his life. "What difference will one more sin make?" The plan they developed over the following weeks was meticulous, designed to create a controlled failure that would expose the project's fundamental flaws without risking lives. They would need to be inside the facility when it happened, ready to manage the fallout and ensure containment. But to sell the narrative, to ensure they wouldn't be suspects, they needed a convincing cover story. And that's what led them to the abandoned warehouse, practicing scenarios until they were flawless. Keller would hold Mia hostage, seemingly coerced into helping him access critical systems. Security footage would capture their apparent struggle, with Mia as the unwilling participant. Only they would know the truth. What they hadn't counted on was Keller's inability to perform violence, even simulated when the moment came. And they certainly hadn't anticipated the containment breach occurring before they were ready. Now, as they raced back to the facility, amid blaring sirens and emergency vehicles, Mia's mind cycled through contingency plans. The radiation badges on facility personnel were already showing elevated readings, not immediately dangerous, but a clear indication that something had gone very wrong. "This doesn't make sense," Keller shouted over the noise as they badged through security. The test sequence wasn't scheduled until next week. A sickening realization hit Mia. She must have been released and pushed up the timeline. The main research floor was controlled chaos, scientists frantically working terminals, security ushering non-essential personnel toward evacuation points. Through the reinforced glass walls of the central chamber, they could see the Prometheus device pulsing with an eerie blue light, its containment field visibly fluctuating. Dr. Chen stood at the primary control station, her face illuminated by the glow of emergency screens. When she spotted them, her expression hardened. "Stay back," she warned as they approached. "Security is on their way to escort you both out." "What have you done, Eliza?" Keller demanded, scanning the system readouts with growing alarm. "You've bypassed half the safety interlocks. I've done what was necessary to keep the project on schedule," she retorted, though Mia detected uncertainty beneath her professional veneer. "Your sabotage set us back weeks." "Sabotage?" Mia stepped closer, registering the elevated radiation readings on the monitors. "We were trying to prevent exactly this scenario." Chen's laugh was bitter. "By drugging me? By interfering with systems you barely understand? The board knows everything. Your unauthorized modifications, your paranoid theories." "Then why is the containment field failing?" Keller pointed to the fluctuating readings. "The models we showed you are playing out exactly as predicted." For a moment, doubt flickered across Chen's face. But before she could respond, a security team arrived, moving purposefully toward Mia and Keller. "Dr. Chen, we need to evacuate now," the lead officer stated firmly. "Radiation levels are approaching critical thresholds in sectors 3 through 7. Just give me 5 more minutes to stabilize." "The field," Chen insisted, turning back to her controls. Mia saw their window closing. Once removed from the facility, they'd have no chance to mitigate the disaster unfolding. Making a split-second decision, she did the one thing no one expected. She grabbed Keller's concealed knife and held it to his throat. "Everyone back off!" she shouted, the blade steady in her hand, unlike Keller's earlier attempt. "Or I'll cut him right here." The security team froze, weapons half drawn. Chen stared in shock. "Mia, what are you doing?" Keller's surprise was genuine, adding credibility to the charade. "What needs to be done?" she hissed, loud enough for others to hear. Then, in a whisper meant only for him, "Play along. Get to the manual override." Understanding dawned in his kaiti eyes. With deliberate movements, he began edging toward the secondary control panel, Mia keeping the knife at his throat. "Dr. Winters, think about what you're doing," Chen said, her voice shifting to a conciliatory tone. "Whatever you believe about the project." "This isn't about beliefs," Mia cut her off. "Your arrogance is going to kill everyone in a 5-mile radius if that containment field collapses completely." As she spoke, keeping all attention on her, Keller reached the override station and began rapidly inputting commands. The security team was calling for backup, but hesitating to approach while she held the knife. "What are you doing?" Chen cried, noticing Keller's actions too late. "Saving lives," he replied, without looking up. "Initiating emergency shutdown. Protocol." Warning klaxons blared as the facility's systems registered the command. The blue pulse of the Prometheus device began to dim, but not before a final surge sent a shockwave through the chamber, shattering one of the glass walls. Mia instinctively shielded her face as shards flew in all directions. When she looked up, chaos had descended. The emergency sprinklers had activated, drenching everything. Through the haze, she saw Chen slumped over her console, blood streaming from a gash on her forehead. Security personnel were helping injured staff toward the exits. And Keller was on his knees before the control panel, hands pressed against his abdomen where a large glass shard had embedded itself. Mia rushed to him, the forgotten knife, clattering to the floor. "James, hold on, we need a medic here." His face was already growing pale, but his eyes were calm. "Did it work?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the alarms. Mia glanced at the readings. The containment field was stabilizing, the radiation levels gradually decreasing as the emergency systems engaged. The catastrophic meltdown they'd feared had been averted, though at significant cost. "It worked," she confirmed, applying pressure around the wound. "Help is coming. Just stay with me." He nodded weakly, then gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "They'll need to know the truth about everything we did." Everything I made you do. She understood what he was offering, a narrative that would absolve her of blame, painting him as the mastermind and her as the reluctant accomplice. A final act of protection. Mia shook her head, a strange sense of peace settling over her despite the chaos. No more lies, she said firmly. Whatever happens next, we face it together. Around them, emergency responders were flooding into the facility. In minutes they would be separated, questioned, possibly arrested. The project was finished. The damage to the facility made that clear. But the reckoning was just beginning. As the paramedics reached them, Mia saw relief in Keller's eyes before they fluttered closed. Whether from her promise or the pain finally overwhelming him, she couldn't tell. But in that moment of raw honesty amidst the ruins of their work, something shifted between them, a recognition that transcended their professional alliance. They had started as reluctant conspirators, united by fear. Somewhere along the way, through moral compromises and desperate gambles, they had forged something unexpected, a bond built on shared culpability and perhaps redemption. As Mia watched them load Keller onto a stretcher, her own future uncertain, she felt the weight of their actions, their sins and their salvation, settling into her bones. Whatever came next, she would bear it without flinching, just like she had faced the knife. 3 months. Later, Mia stood alone on the observation deck of her high-rise apartment, watching the sunset paint the downtown skyline in fiery hues. The federal investigation into Helios was ongoing, but the immediate legal consequences had been resolved through a complex plea arrangement. Limited immunity in exchange for full disclosure of the project's flaws and the actions she and Keller had taken. The public narrative painted them as whistleblowers who'd gone to extreme measures to prevent a catastrophe, not entirely accurate, but close enough to a truth that Mia could live with. Helios was shuttering its quantum research division, its stock in freefall as lawsuits mounted. Dr. Chen had survived her injuries, but faced potential charges for violating safety protocols. And Keller. Keller had survived against the odds, though his recovery would be long. They hadn't spoken since that day, separated by legal counsel and medical necessity. Today, finally, that would change. The knock at her door was soft but deliberate. When she opened it, the man standing there seemed both familiar and strange, thinner, grayer, with a new guardedness in his posture. But his eyes were the same, meeting hers directly now in a way they rarely had before. "You look better," Mia said, stepping aside to let him in. "Amazing what nearly dying will do for one's appearance," Keller replied dryly, following her to the living room. He moved carefully, one hand unconsciously resting where the glass had pierced him. For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of their shared history filling the space between them. "The Torres family sent me a letter," Mia said finally. "They wanted to know if there was anything that could have been done to prevent Michael's exposure." Keller's expression tightened. "What did you tell them?" "The truth, that we tried, but not hard enough, not soon enough." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm tired of convenient narratives." He nodded, understanding. "That's why I'm here, actually. I've been offered a position with the Regulatory Commission, reviewing advanced energy projects for safety compliance." A hint of irony touched his voice. "Apparently, my unique perspective is valuable." "Are you going to take it?" "I think I have to." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "We can't change what happened, but maybe we can prevent the next Prometheus." Mia considered this, thinking of all they had sacrificed and compromised. The line between heroism and villainy had proven thinner than she ever imagined. "What about you?" Keller asked. "What comes next?" She hadn't told anyone her plans yet, not her lawyer, not the investigators, not even herself until recently, but looking at Keller now, she felt he deserved to know. "I'm starting a consulting firm, safety audits for high-risk research facilities, with a focus on ethical oversight." She paused. "Someone needs to ask the uncomfortable questions before it's too late." A smile, rare and genuine, transformed Keller's face. "The voice of reason," something like that. She returned the smile, feeling a weight lift. They were different people now than when they'd first met in her office. More scarred, perhaps, but also more honest with themselves and each other. As the last light faded, from the sky, casting the room in gentle shadows, Mia realized that while some echoes of their actions would follow them forever, they had each found a way to carry the weight. Not alone, but alongside each other, bound by choices that had nearly destroyed them, yet somehow pointed them toward redemption. Not absolution, never that, but perhaps something equally valuable. Purpose born from understanding the true cost of compromise. And in its own way, that was enough. Character count 15,000 characters, including spaces and punctuation,